let's go and get started here. I'm actually going to get up for this one, inshallah. I rested for the last one. All right. All right. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Wassalatu wassalam ala Rasulillah. Okay. So this may be a section you're looking forward to, if not. But, so this section, what it talks about is, well, it asks the following question: does science lead to atheism? In a lot of the environment that we're in, it almost seems like that in order for you to be, say, scientific, you would have to be an atheist, right? And that science never leads to atheism. Okay? So we want to now unpack that. And we'll look at basically two things we're going to cover. Number one, the question, does science lead to atheism? And number two, does science disprove theistic claims? Right? This is up there. I'll change that next time. Okay? Does it negate claims about the existence of Allah? Okay, so these are the two questions we're going to be focusing the discussion on. Inshallah, getting a bit deep. Okay, now we'll look at the first one, and it says science leads to atheism. This is the claim that's made. It's based upon 4 false assumptions. The first assumption is that the only way to know something to be true is by way of science. So science is the only yardstick to tell whether something is true or whether something is false. That's the first assumption. The second assumption is that because science works, it is true. Don't we have a cell phone, an iPhone, and that's all based on science, it's based on technology, and they all work. Must be true. Number 3, science leads to certainty. That's the third assumption. And the fourth assumption has to do with naturalism. We touched upon this earlier. It is confusing philosophical naturalism and methodological. It's taking a method within the project of science and saying that that's true across the board. So you move from method to philosophy. Okay? So these are the 4 assumptions, false assumptions we're going to unpack. Let's start with the first one. That science is the only yardstick for truth. The thing is that science itself has certain limitations as an endeavor. So one of the first limitations is that it is limited to observation. You cannot observe everything. So whatever your observation is limited to, that's what your conclusion will be limited to. Okay. The second one is that it's morally neutral. Science cannot tell you anything about morals. It is amoral. It cannot decide whether something is right or wrong as a project in and of itself. Number 3, you can't delve into the personal. I have an inner subjective experience when I eat something, when I experience something. There's no way to directly tap into that. Number 4, it can't answer why things happen. So it can tell me the how, it doesn't explain the why. The next one, it can't address the metaphysical questions. The next one, there are other sources of knowledge, and then it can't prove necessary truth. So we're going to get into each one of these a little bit. So the first one, it is limited to observation. And so what we're talking about here is that the fact that it works by way of observing phenomena and then looking at patterns and assuming something about the patterns that they're seeing means that it's based upon observation. The problem is that there is a limit to observation. We don't know if in some future time period you have more sophisticated, let's say, tools that allow the scope of observation to increase, that those results in the future contradict, right? There's no way to know that until you actually get there. Okay? There's an interesting book by Thomas Kuhn called The Structure of Scientific Revolutions. And when he talks about those paradigm shifts, because now as time changes, technology changes, you get something in the future, and then not the future, but you find out something, it completely negates a previous paradigm. Okay? So the quintessential example of that would be moving from a geocentric understanding of the universe to a heliocentric understanding. Okay, for the longest time, the assumption was the Earth is the center of the universe, and all the observations that were done were based upon that assumption. Okay, calculations happened, there are a lot of science that happened. But then once there was the shift to understanding that in fact the sun is the center of the universe, well, now you have a paradigm shift. But when you were in the paradigm where you assume that the Earth is the center of the universe, you don't know that in the future there's going to be a shift, and therefore the calculations do well until the shift actually happens. Okay, and this is true for across all of science. So one of the limitations of science is that it's limited to observation, and that's why Elliot Sober, he writes, at any moment scientists are limited by the observations they have at hand. The limitation is that science is forced to restrict its attention to problems that observations solve. Can you observe everything? Even if we don't look at like future events, even currently, can you observe every single thing? No. So clearly there's a limit of observation, even if you don't take the future into consideration. So science has the limit of observation. It can't be the only yardstick of truth. Okay? That's number one. Number two, it's morally neutral. Science does not tell us whether something is moral or immoral. It only tells us about how things work, but what sort of moral valuation you give it, it cannot say inside of that. Now, I'm not saying that scientists are all immoral. That's not what I mean. But I'm saying, as a project, we cannot give a valuation to say this is moral or this is it is a moral endeavor. Therefore, it's not the only yardstick of truth because it can tell you nothing about morals. Everyone with me so far? Okay. It can't delve into the personal. When I eat, let's say a chocolate cake, I have an inner subjective experience of what that cake is like. Nobody can access that. And the only way you know what it's like to eat a chocolate cake, me personally, is if I tell you. But even that, there's no way for you to access the direct experience that I have eating a chocolate cake. I can tell you it's chocolatey, sweet, it's creamy, it's fluffy, whatever. I can give you descriptions, and maybe you can understand that by way of testimony. But there's no way for you to be able to test the personal directly, right? So you move from testing to testimony. Okay, so now that's not scientific endeavor. Now it's not a direct testing, but direct trusting. You have to trust what I'm saying is true. Okay, so science can't delve into the personal. It has a limitation. Right? Okay. All right. It can't say why things happen. So science can tell you everything there is about making this cake. You might do a replica cake. Let's say my mom made this cake for me. Okay. Now maybe you can say, I love you because she loves me, that's why she baked it. That's not a scientific problem. There's no way for the scientist to know, unless again moving from testimony, as to why my mom baked the cake. They may able to tell us how she baked it, the ingredients, the temperature, whatever it might be. But they can't answer why. So science does not answer the why question. They don't answer the how questions. Yeah. I'm not talking. Yeah, okay. Talking about feeling, sure.
Irrespective of which science involved.
Yep.
They are production, research, science comes to a point, not just by they have certain steps which they follow. When you say cannot answer why things happen,
yeah,
that doesn't register with me because
okay.
Why A plus 1 plus 1 is 2.
Right.
Why it's 2? So it's 1.
Sure.
So
I get what you're trying to say. So here what I'm talking about why is that, let's say in this case it's a personal motivation. There's no access to that why. Okay. But even if we took your example, let's say you have an observation and you see this particular thing as this cause, why does it have that cause? Maybe you can say, okay, because something went on. Why is there a causal link in the first place? You know what I'm saying? Purpose, right? Why? Why does X cause Y? Yes, you can say it causes Y in this scenario, this scenario, this scenario. Why does it cause a link? This is the first place. Yeah. Can't answer that. Point is that, okay, so remember, what we're saying here is that there's a number of reasons why science cannot be totally yardstick to truth, right? There are other things you can use to get the truth, okay? So we're just looking at certain issues within that particular section. All right, can I address some of the metaphysical questions? It goes back to what you were saying. Metaphysical question, the nature of the causal link. What is the exact nature? We have known. You can't answer questions about consciousness. We've been talking about since yesterday, right? That conscious experience that you have, that intentionality, where does intentionality come? What cell is it found in? What neuron is it? Where does it come from? Can't answer that. Okay? Can't answer. So these are metaphysical questions. They go beyond the physical. You can't answer questions about metaphysics. Okay. Next one. There are other sources of knowledge. All right. So as the picture said, did Genghis Khan exist? He did? How do we know that? By way of testimony, right? Of course, you don't know that science didn't tell us that, did it? No, it didn't. You know that by way of testimony. Okay? How many people think that the world is round? Raise your hands. That the world is round. No flat earthers? No, some of them didn't raise your hands. Y'all are about flat earthers? That's what it is. All right, so most of us, except for a few of us, believe the world is round. Yeah? Okay. How do we know that? Okay, testimony. Yes, but I need to have one guy say like yes, but. Okay, please. Yeah. Sure. Have you done that personally? Yeah, you looked over the horizon, you saw the entire curvature of the earth. Heard you. You have. How do you know that? You believe certain. But is that direct testing or is that testimony? Testimony, right? Okay, it's based on science. Who said that? Somebody said that. Based on scientific evidence. Okay, how do you know that's scientific? Okay, so it's based. Fair enough. How do you know that?
Because I believe that that person exists, I believe that they're not alive, and because it's been reviewed, be accepted.
Sure.
So the fact that we're reviewed by enough people that you can classify all of them as categories as fine.
Wonderful. Right. That's a scientific process that you went.
Yes.
You empirically tested that.
No, I didn't.
Okay, so you didn't do that. That's all I'm saying. That the process that you got to say that is true is not a scientific process. It is testimonial. Yes or no? Sure. No, I mean, if you disagree, like I understand what you're saying, but again, at the end of the day, it doesn't move, it's not going to be direct testing. You have to move from testing to trusting. Yeah? So testimony is a source of knowledge that's not science. Yes or no? So there are other sources of knowledge. Like if I ask you guys, do you guys believe your mother is your mother? How many of you believe that your mother is your mother? Raise your hands. All right, the rest of y'all don't believe that? Back there on the wall. Are your mothers here? They have no idea what I'm talking about. Okay. All right. How do you do that? Testimony, right? Okay, fair enough. You don't have that one guy that's like, okay. I always have that one guy or one sister. DNA testing, right? Okay. We'll take that, all right? Who wants to knock that one down? You have to take the DNA marker's word for what it is. It's still testimony. Even if you took the DNA test and sent it in, which nobody's done, by the way, as long as I'm doing this. Let's say you did. How do you know that's true? You only know that's true, right? So, what we're talking about here is that there's other sources of knowledge. One of those other sources is testimony. In fact, you could even argue the majority of your knowledge is not scientific, but testimony. You can make that argument. To your person, right? Sure. Sure. Again, we're talking about one person, right? The majority of your knowledge is not something that you empirically test yourself to get the information, right? And the majority of it is testimony. Okay, so testimony is really important. And by the way, this is not the entire project of the philosophy of science. It's at university level generally, unless you take something in the Department of Philosophy. Okay, as such, testimony is not really highlighted as a source of knowledge. But what's interesting is that since most of our knowledge comes from testimony anyway, you don't have a robust system within Western academia to affirm testimony. In comparison to, right? I'm saying this, I'm actually very fully honest and blunt with that, right? Even in Western academia, when you get a paper, the writer, you may have some information about it, right? But generally you don't. Your background is maybe self-his PhD, university classical, maybe at best. Okay? But in terms of a detailed analysis of who he is, where he's from, what are his motivations, did he write this because he got, he had a payoff from some pharmaceutical company and the other, you don't really do that. You just have research papers. Go to whatever site, download it, home, you have your research, right? So yes, there is a process, but when you compare that to robust process of establishing testimonial reports in the Islamic tradition, there's actually no comparison. Because we understood very early on that one of the sources of knowledge is testimony. And if it is testimony, you need a way to establish what is truthful testimony versus what is not truthful testimony. Okay. Now we understand that maybe perhaps after I explained it, look, testimony, majority of what you know is testimony, right? That's the case. You only have one system in the entire world that takes it seriously and establishes a system to actually do something about it. And that's, evidence. Make sense? Yeah. Okay. So other source of knowledge, testimonial knowledge. Okay. Science doesn't prove necessary truths, axioms. Okay. So, all right, you've got a deductive setup here. All bachelors are unmarried men. John is a bachelor. Therefore, John is an unmarried man. Okay. There's a logical relation between the premises and the conclusion. Right? So, premise one, all bachelors are unmarried men. Premise two, John is a bachelor. Therefore, John is an unmarried man. There's a logical relation. How does science prove the logical relation? Not a scientific question. It's axiomatic. Okay. So science doesn't delve into axioms. So it doesn't go there. Okay. Now, this is the best one. If science is the only way to truth, how do you use science to prove that statement? Self-defeating. If science is the only way to truth, that's your statement. How do you prove that statement? By necessity, you need to have something outside of science, which then that statement is defeated. Right? You're gone. You're finished, as someone very famous once said. Okay. All right. So that's the first section. All right. And the first section, just to go back for a second, that science. So science is the only yardstick for truth. We went over some of those. Any questions about this particular section? Everyone understand that science is not the only yardstick for truth. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Okay. So we're going to get there. We'll get in time. Inshallah, we'll get there. But I'll kind of touch upon it. And that is going to be when we talk about the section this night on does science lead to certainty? Okay. What we're going to see is that science cannot get you to absolute certainty. The reason is because of the way that science works in terms of its structure. In other words, it doesn't work in a deductive way. All right. What that means is that when it basically moves to a specific observation and a general. Okay, so let's say I observe 10,000 black crows. Okay, so the conclusion is crows are black. Right? Let's say I observe 1,000,000 black crows. Okay, now I'm certain. Do I know for a fact that I would never observe a pink crow? No. Right? Why? Because it works in an inductive way, not a deductive way. Okay, it's certain. If that's the case, then science is always it's mutable. It's always going to be shifting, right? And if that's the case, that's what makes science beautiful in the first place. We're always discovering new things. If that's the case, you can't get to absolute certainty by way of science, and you have this immutable endeavor. So yes, right now the claim can be made about X, Y, and Z, but there's no way to say it's absolutely not absolutely certain about it, right? So okay, you have certain conclusions within science, and by the way, scientists themselves, and these people that are serious in this field, never talk about scientific facts. They're actually very cautious in terms of this is a scientific fact. Because they understand when you say fact, it means there's nothing more to talk about, right? And if you understand the philosophy of science, you can never say that. You never come to this, okay, no, there's nothing else to say about this ever again. Make sense? Okay, I kind of jumped the gun there. All right, so science is the only yardstick for truth. We already dismantled that. Oh, okay. So we went through all of that. Let's go on to the next one. Too fast. Okay. All right, science works. Therefore, conclusions are true. We have the iPhone, we have cars, we have all this technology. If science works, its conclusions must be true, right? Okay. The problem is that you can have something that works, that's put together as a theory, and yet it can be proven to be false. One example is what they call phlogiston. So phlogiston is this material that has to do with how we understand how fire and smoke work. Okay, for a long time it was used, and it was used successfully in many different fields, many different technologies that are today. But later on, they came back and said, hold on, combustion doesn't work like that. There is no such thing as phlogiston, and they completely scrapped it. But it doesn't mean that the train stopped working and those things stopped working. They still work. And if you want more of a, kind of a more pertinent example, but if we understand that when we compare Newtonian physics with the physics of Einstein, they actually contradict each other. And if that's the case, we use Newtonian physics to get to the root, man, right? But we know that a lot of those conclusions, when we look at the extreme macro level and extreme micro level, that they fall apart. So they're not necessarily true when we didn't come up with, but yet we still use them. So just because something works doesn't mean it's true. That makes sense, right? It gives us something that works, doesn't necessarily mean it's true. Okay? Okay. All right, this is actually what I was talking about, the problem of induction. So the idea that science leads to certainty. I said I jumped it. All right, there's always be a new observation that can be at odds with our conclusions based on our previous limited data. That's why Gillian Barker, Philip Kitchener, in this book, Philosophy of Science, they say science is revisable. Hence, the talk of scientific proof is dangerous because the term fosters the idea of conclusions that are graded in stone. And that's why they say it's a dangerous way of talking about scientific proof, right? Because what that means is you close the door, there's nothing more to do. You can't get anywhere, you can't go anywhere. But its process is inductive, right? Let me compare that to a process that is deductive. All right, so we already looked at some arguments that are deductive, but a deductive argument leads you to certainty. Okay, induction does not. So a deductive argument, let's take another one, throw it out there. That is usually composed of two premises and a conclusion. Okay, so let's say if I said premise one, all presidents of the United States were men. Premise two, Joe Biden is the president of the United States. Conclusion, Joe Biden is the man. Okay. If 1 and 2 are true, 3 necessarily has to. Science does not work like this. It does not work in a deductive fashion. It works in inductive fashion, meaning it takes a limited data set and then generalizes. Like the example I gave you, the black rose, that's across the board. So you have a number of observations that you have, you make a conclusion, it can be revisable. Why? Go back to limited observation. You could observe something in the future which contradicts current. Therefore, you can never get absolute certainty within the project of science. Okay, make sense? Okay, philosophical naturalism. We've already talked about this time on it, but remember, naturalism is the assumption. It's an assumption that we use within the project of science, whatever science you're doing, whether it's a field of medicine, whether it's a field of chemistry, biochemistry, whatever it is. All right, the assumption is that everything that we're going to explain is going to be explained by natural processes only. Okay, naturalism, the idea that every sort of phenomenon will be explained by physical processes. Okay, in the realm of science, that's okay if you use that as a method, as an assumption. Okay, the problem is if you take it out of the realm of science and say that's true across the board. That's where the problem lies. And that becomes a problem because there's no way to prove that assumption. It's just an assertion. And then you just gone out and saying method to philosophy. Okay? So, all right, so assumes the non-scientific assumption of philosophical naturalism. This is the metaphysical view that there is no God, no supernatural, and everything can be explained by way of physical processes. Okay? And in fact, Michael Ruse writes this, I think it's really interesting. He says, if you want a concession, I've always said that naturalism is an act of faith. If you're going to take naturalism, it's an assumption, you basically have to base on faith to take it. Okay, so remember, science is limited, it has epistemic value that is limited, it doesn't make you absolute certain. Now let me talk about, actually, let's see what we have next. All right, let's come back to does the science lead to atheism? Why doesn't it? Well, number one, science can't observe God. Remember, it's limited to observation. So it's limited to observation, God is not observable. So it's outside the scope and domain of science as a question. So the question of God is not a scientific question. It doesn't enter into the field. Number two, if we're trying to show, okay, well, does God exist, does not exist, there are other sources of knowledge that can get you to mathematics, we talk about that, but testimony, you have all these other sources of knowledge that transcend science. Science isn't the only yardstick for truth. Okay, now, we said that there's a conflation between methodological and philosophical naturalism. Taking the idea of naturalism, something that works within science, and exporting it is just an assumption. So you know what? If we're going to give an explanation, it has to be part of the physical world. It has to be a physical explanation. Why? Because science says so. Okay, so it's just an assumption you take it from one domain and apply it across the board. Okay, and the other one, explaining how things work, do not disprove that they have a creator. Just because you can say how something works doesn't mean that you can tell us why. What is the source of whatever that thing is that we're talking about? Okay, is this clear? Okay, I'm going to touch on a very touchy topic that I think we need to cover before I go. Might not be touchy anymore. Yeah.
Science can be separated from it, or considered as something separate from just the data of science and not the analysis of it.
Okay. So what I'm saying is that science has a specific domain. It has specific, let's say, epistemic borders, if you want to call it that. As long as you keep it in its epistemic borders, it's fine. There's no problem. So I hope you don't take from this and say Islam is science. That's all I'm saying. Okay. What I'm trying to say is to take our almost intuitive sense that science has some sort of really grand epistemic value and say, look, it's not as complicated. Okay, so there's nothing wrong with doing science and using science and using naturalism even as an assumption within its domain. But it has a specific domain, right? It's going to deal with the physical. It's not going to deal with the metaphysical. And so, for instance, when we talk about the argument from dependency, it's not a scientific conversation. Can't say anything about it. Similarly, if you ask a question about God, can science prove God? It's not a scientific question, right? Because it's a metaphysical concept, right? I don't know if that answers your question, but yeah, okay, yes.
Yeah, so replying to this question, also the one question on the back about evolution. Because we're Muslims, the facts we deal with are not just scientific facts. For example, we know a lot of stuff about how Allah created us.
Sure.
That's all this stuff. So our facts that we're using to understand reality include scientific facts and facts from the Quran.
Right.
So we don't have the same conclusions. Like for example, atheists believe in randomness. We don't believe randomness, especially when it comes to like evolution and stuff. However, and this is something I think is unnecessary conflict. I feel like people throw out evolution, like throw the baby out with the bathwater. I feel like just because we believe in Adam alayhi salam being a prophet, being born miraculously, in the Adam, like Adam alayhi salam is like Isa alayhi salam, right? Isa alayhi salam also did not have a father. Adam alayhi salam did not have a father. Even though, so we know, even if we didn't know about evolution, Isa alayhi salam, Adam alayhi salam have miraculous. Even if someone sees dinosaurs, you see fossil certificates, you see all these species, none of that, like we know that the human race is special. So we know from our facts that, oh yeah, human beings is a special race. So I feel like a lot of unnecessary conflict, you made a whole war between ideology and facts. But all you need to do is understand the facts with a different framework and interpretation. I feel like there's a lot of unnecessary confusion with people like people, oh, solutions are wrong. It's like you can understand the facts while incorporating both sets of facts together. Some is true, it's X, Y, Z. You know, the scientific facts, like dinosaurs existed, other species of monkeys and creatures. But we also know that human beings are. So we just need to incorporate both. Like we don't need to pick their rhetoric, their.
Okay, wait, hold on a second. Let me stop you there. Yes, to some degree, that's true, right? But the thing is, this gets back to when we were, like yesterday, we were talking about components or parts of a worldview. Yesterday? Right? Yesterday, right? We're talking about the components of a worldview. Under components of a worldview, remember we talked about epistemology. Okay? Epistemology has to do with sources of knowledge. Okay? What we're talking about in this section is that generally people tend to think that unless it's scientifically proven, it's not proven. Because their source of knowledge is only science. So from one degree, yes, we don't jettison the entire project of science, come to certain conclusions. But when you have a conflict between, let's say, science and the Quran, which one has a higher epistemic value? Okay, it'll always be the Quran. Why? Well, for whatever reason, there's another section we get into tomorrow about how we judge the epistemic value of the Quran. But we don't need science. This is the area that I'm going to talk about next. We understand that the Quran has a higher epistemic value, and the two are contradictory. Take the Quran over that. Why? Because by way of other things than science, like you said, testimony, logical principles, math, there's so many different other sources of how we know truth. And then we say, okay, hold on a second, these two things are conflicting. Now, sometimes what happens is, could be an interpretation that's off. So now science might say, have a little more to say about that. Something like Adam and Islam evolution, science always works in patterns because it's based on observation, right? The most you can do is say these are patterns that happen. What he was highlighting is that yes, there's patterns that happen, but then there are things where Allah breaks those patterns. Adam and Islam is a break in the pattern. So science can't tell us anything about that. You can't say yes, it's true or no, it's not true, because it's not a scientific question. It's breaking the pattern. Make sense? The sisters that asked the question, right? Again, it goes up back down to what is your sources of knowledge? Okay? And by the way, this is not a new question. I just want to kind of address this. This goes back to the concept of what we call aql and naql, right? reason and revelation. Which one do you give precedence to? And there's a whole, well, we have a whole course on this that's called, it's about the fifth art. So I don't want to get into now, but put simply, you have to understand what are the sources of knowledge and what is their epicenter. Once you understand that, anything someone throws at you in terms of science, you can say, hold on a second, if it contradicts the Quran, or if it contradicts a certain hadith, or whatever it might be, it's a valid second hadith. Okay, I don't have a problem with it because science is not something that leads to 100% certainty anyway. It's always mutable. And this leads me to my next point. That'll probably be my point for tonight. Probably because it's debatable to do that. So anyway, here's the contentious point. In some circles, I think it's become less contentious now. How many people think that there are scientific miracles? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. This is why I said 7. This is why I said it's contentious. So let me just state what I'm going to state, and then if you want to, say I've left this out or whatever the deal is, it's fine. I'll leave it to their mind. Sorry, I'm getting it, all right? So what I'm going to say is that I don't believe there are scientific miracles in the Quran. Are you troubled by that? Okay. Why is it a problem to say there's scientific miracles? Here's why. When you say that we're going to look at a miracle to prove that the Quran is from Allah, okay? The Quran is absolute. It has an epistemic value that is absolute. Science as an endeavor is mutable. It is changeable. It is always being updated. You take this mutable thing and say this absolute thing, we're going to prove it. Does anyone see the problem in that method? It's a big problem. And what happened is this, and unfortunately, it's popularized a lot in the Muslim world, a lot in Dawah and all these other spaces, but it's a methodological problem. In fact, it's a methodological nightmare when you say it. Okay? First of all, there's no sort of traditional evidence for that anyway. So I don't have any problem saying that because, scholars of the past never mentioned that. You know, the new field, whatever it might be. Why is it a problem? Because you can go to a college campus, I have the experience. Somebody says, oh, the Quran, it's got scientific miracles. So the Quran says, the mountains are pegs. How is the Prophet have known that they're pegs? And then this young man meets a geology professor who has a PhD from MIT in geology and says, we don't really believe in pegs anymore. We understand how mountains are based on tectonic plates. So clearly, your ancient book is wrong. It's a methodological. Again, science is a mutable endeavor. It never gets to absolute certainty. If you're going to peg the validity of the Quran upon science, the problem is the second that science moves and there's something new that's observed, what happens to your miracle? Gone. Right? That's why when we talk about miracles, we have to be really careful. Even the English word miracle is problematic. It's problematic because the word in Arabic we generally use is right? It's a word which is that. What does that mean? It comes from ajiz. It means to incapacitate. It's a challenge. It's a challenge, right? It's a challenge to someone to bring something like it. Is this challenge scientific? No, it's linguistic, right? That is something that still can't be. And that's another topic for another day. But is that clear why it's methodologically a nightmare to say that the Quran is scientific miracles? Now, does that mean that when we have observations and we do scientific experiments and we observe things in nature, that has no value? No. When you observe things in nature, you come to some sort of conclusions in science based on the information that you have, and you see that it's in the Quran, great, it's an ayah, it includes your iman. But to say miracle, that's where it gets a bit problematic, right? Why? Because it goes back to epistemic value. The Quran's epistemic value is higher than the epistemic value of science. And if you're going to use this thing of a lower epistemic value to prove that of a higher epistemic value, you're dead in the world, right? At some point. Okay, and again, I know it's popular, a lot of speakers and this and that, they used it for a long time, becoming less popular. more people understand the philosophy of science. But it's important that we don't take that narrative and move forward. Unfortunately, a lot of this stuff is taught like in Islamic schools as well. Look at this science, this science, blah, 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 blah. And some of those things may be valid. There's a paper, and I'll leave you with this, that Hamza Zortz's wrote. It's on the multi-layered and multi-level approach of the meaning. It's fascinating that the Quran can speak to the 7th century era and speak to the 21st century man as well, because of the flexibility in the word choice that is used. So even if someone takes a scientific approach, they'll see that the words and how they're used are general enough that understanding of the world for someone who's in the 7th century is not contradicted, and the understanding of reality for someone in the 21st century is also not contradicted. All right? And you can read that paper, it's on the State Institute website. I'll highly recommend it. It gets into the topic of embryology. That's where this becomes sticky. And he talks about that in a lot of detail. Okay? But everyone understands that it's a bit of it's a major problem to say scientific miracles prove the Quran. Yes? Okay. So we have 5 minutes left. Yes. So I was going to say, if anyone have questions, 5 minutes left. All right, go for it. That's something you don't understand? No, it's not even you would understand the miracle. If you don't understand it, it's just confusion. Right? No, I'm saying, no. So when I say miracle, so that's what I say. The problem is you don't understand the word. When we're talking about miracles, we're talking about what is that? The word in Arabic is incapacity. When prophets bring miracles, why do they bring them? As a challenge. It's a challenge to those, right? The process of God is a challenge to those people that would say, bring it from life. Is that a scientific challenge? No. Right? The challenge is linguistic. And that's, in fact, there's a deep reason why it's rooted in language, which I can't get into now. Then we have to open the door for philosophy of language. And maybe tomorrow, if you want to know about that, it's very interesting how, how language works. That it's the wisdom of Allah that made it last, more to be one of the rooted in language. Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah, you can say there's signs. Maybe ayat, observable ayat, Again, the point is that those things, to say they prove the promise of Allah, that's when you get into a lot of problems. Because that's not what the Quran does anyway. That's not what the Prophet sent. He sent the linguistic aspect of it. Right? And by the way, once you understand the linguistic aspect, even in English, you can present it in a way that really it isn't. Right? It's just the ability to articulate it. Right? It's much, much more effective, obviously, than science, the whole science area. To be honest, like how many people in the science area do this? That's an open question. Okay, any other last questions? 3 minutes. Yeah. Okay, so I didn't say no extent. I said science has a lower extent. Yes. Because also it has value. It's not able to reject science. No. Because the idea of the Quran is that when it comes to it, you're at a level of certainty. Science does not lead to absolute certainty. Because of the fact that we talk about induction, population, all of it. Right? So by necessity, the certainty in the Quran is made to be more than the certainty of whatever science.
Probably would stress like an apparent contradiction. Like someone has to be careful with the Quran itself having the absolute, highest level of authority.
Yeah.
Versus how you understand when it.
Of course. So that's the other thing. It's like, okay, are we dealing with translation? So in the realm that the Quran is understood as it's supposed to be understood, you don't get any more certain, right? And especially with core concepts of the Quran, there's no sort of difference of opinion. But yes, There may be certain ayat, you interpret like this, you interpret like that, and maybe you could have an interpretation that reconciles a certain scientific observation with the Quran. In fact, you might do that many times, right? Many scholars did that in the past, right? For many things that they observed in nature, they said, okay, look, the Quran also mentions this as well, but they never claimed, at least classical scholars said, oh, this is the mark. This is a miracle, right? Because they had to understand it. All right, 1 minute. Wait, you have a question? No, you didn't? Okay, yeah.
I will say similar to what I feel like there's too many coincidences. Like for example, embryology, that's not going to change. Those kind
You
of
sure? I mean, I don't know, man. There's a lot of so look, with those type of cases, go to Hamza, right? Because he does a really good job of breaking down embryology specifically.
I feel like as long as you're not absolute about it, you can still use this as like a tertiary aspect. Like, if like
So again, are we saying evidence or are we saying miracle?
like evidence, not so I'm not using that.
Okay, evidence for what?
Reinforcing the Islamic character. How like, for example, if someone's
Okay.
already Muslim, they're like
Yeah, so that's why I said, if you want to use it as ayat, that it keeps you in your iman, that's fine, there's no problem. My contention is just say, look, to say that this proves this, that is gonna get you in some hot water. Even with embryology. All right, Jazakumullah khair, we have to stop there. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala bless all of you. Inshallah, we've got sessions tomorrow. We'll be talking about objective morality and a few other things. I believe that starts at 10 a.m. Nice, bright and early. And then we'll conclude tomorrow. But may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala bless you. May Allah reward you. I know it's been a really long day. You've been sitting here listening to me go on and on and on. So if I said anything that was mistaken, wrong, or offensive, please forgive me for that. Any sort of benefit is from Allah, and anything else that's wrong, mistaken, problematic is for myself. Shaitan.